Hello guys and gals, and this is part 17 of our reading of The Last Unicorn by Peter Beagle. In the last episode, Smendrick, Prince Lear, the unicorn, Molly Grew, well, the whole group of them, they found their way through the clock, and now they're on their way to see the Red Bull, and the Red Bull is probably going to appear any second. So we are nearing the big, exciting conclusion of this story. And we only have about 22 pages left to go, so we're going to get started. And right now, Molly Grew is kind of scolding Smendrick, accusing him of just not really caring about anybody and just being concerned about magic and stuff like that. She's being kind of mean to him, actually, but I think he'll be fine. Okay, but we're going to go back to this paragraph right here. Smendrick must have carried her for a time because she was definitely not walking, and his green eyes were ringing in her head. That's right, nothing but magic matters to me. I would round up unicorns for Haggard myself if it would heighten my power by half a hair. It's true. I have no preferences and no loyalties. I have only magic. His voice was hard and sad. Really? She asked, rocking dreamily in his terror, watching the brightness flowing by. That's awful. She was very impressed. Are you really like that? No, he said. Then or later. No, that's not true. How could I be like that and still have all these troubles? Then he said, Molly, you have to walk now. He's there. He's there. Molly saw the horns first. The light made her cover her face, but the pale horns struck bitterly through hands and eyelids to the back of her mind. She saw Prince Lear and the Lady Amalthea standing before the horns, while the fire flourished on the walls of the cavern and soared up into the roofless dark. Prince Lear had drawn his sword, but it blazed up in his hand, and he let it fall, and it broke like ice. The Red Bull stamped his foot, and everyone fell down. Smendrick had thought to find the bull waiting in his lair or in some wide place with room enough to do battle, but he had come silently up the passageway to meet them, and now he stood across their sight, not only from one burning wall to the other, but somehow in the walls themselves and beyond them, bending away forever. Yet he was no mirage, but the Red Bull still steaming and snuffing, shaking his blind head, his jaws champed over his breath with a terrible wallowing sound. Now is the time. Whether I work ruin or great good, this is the end of it. The magician rose slowly to his feet, ignoring the bull, listening only to his cupped self, as to a seashell. But no power stirred or spoke in him. He could hear nothing but the far, thin howling of emptiness against his ear, as old Haggard must have heard it, waking and sleeping, and never another sound. It will not come to me. Nikos was wrong. I am what I seem. The Lady Amalthea had stepped back a pace from the bull, but no more, and she was regarding him quietly as he pawed with his front feet and snorted great, rumbling, rainy blasts out of his vast nostrils. He seemed puzzled about her, and almost foolish. He did not roar. The Lady Amalthea stood in his freezing light, with her head tipped back to see all of him. Without turning her head, she put her hand out to find Prince Lear's hand. Okay. Good. There is nothing I can do, and I am glad of it. The bull will let her by, and she will go away with Lear. It is as right as anything. I am only sorry about the unicorns. The prince has not yet noticed her offered hand, but in a moment he will turn and see and touch her for the first time. He will never know what she has given him, but neither will she. The Red Bull lowered his head and charged. He came without warning, with no sound but the rip of his hooves, and if he had chosen, he could have crushed all four of them in that one silent onslaught, but he let them scatter before him and flatten themselves into the wrinkled walls, and he went by without harming them, though he might easily have horned them out of their shallow shelters like so many periwinkles. Supple as fire, he turned where there was no room to turn, and met them again, his muzzle almost touching the ground, his neck swelling like a wave. It was then that he roared. They fled, and he followed, not as swiftly as he had charged, but quickly enough to keep each one alone, friendless in the wild dark. The ground tore under his feet, and they cried out, and they could not even hear themselves. Every bellow of the Red Bull brought great slides of stone and earth shuddering down on them, and still they scrambled along like broken insects, and still he came after them. Through his mad blaring, they heard another sound, the deep whine of the castle itself as it strained at its roots, drumming like a flag in the wind of its wrath. And very faintly there drifted up the passage the smell of the sea. He knows, I fooled him once that way, but not again. Woman or unicorn, he will hunt her into the sea this time, as he was bidden, and no magic of mine will turn him from it, haggard as one. So the magician thought as he ran, all hope gone for the first time in his long, strange life. The way widened suddenly and then emerged into a kind of grotto that could only have been the bull's den. The stench of his sleeping hung so thick and old here that it had a loathy sweetness about it, and the cave brooded gullet red as though his light had rubbed off on the walls and crusted in the cracks and crevices. Beyond lay the tunnel again, and the dim gleam of breaking water. The Lady Amalthea fell as irrevocably as a flower breaks. Smendrick leapt to one side, wheeling to drag Molly Grew with him. They brought up hard against the split slab of rock, and there they crouched together as the Red Bull raged by without turning. But he came to a halt between one stride and the next, and the sudden stillness broke only by the bull's breathing and the distant grinding of the sea. Would have been absurd but for the cause of it. She lay on her side with one leg bent beneath her. She moved slowly, but she made no sound. Prince Lear stood between her body and the bull, weaponless, but with his hands up, as though they still held a sword and shield. Once more in this endless night, the prince said no. He looked very foolish, and he was about to be trampled flat. The Red Bull could not see him, and would kill him without even knowing that he had been in the way. Wonder and love and great sorrow shook Smendrick the magician then, and came together inside of him and filled him until he felt himself brimming and flowing with something that was none of these. He did not believe it, but it came to him anyways, as it had touched him twice before and left him more barren than he had been. This time there was too much of it for him to hold. It spilled through his skin, sprang from his fingers and toes, welled up equally in his eyes and his hair, and the hollows of his shoulders. There was too much of it to hold, too much even to use, and still he found himself weeping with the pain of his impossible greed. He thought or said or sang, I did not know that I was so empty, to be so full. The Lady Amalthea lay where she had fallen, though now she was trying to rise, and Prince Lear still guarded her, raising his naked hands against the enormous shape that loomed over him. The tip of the prince's tongue stuck out to one corner of his mouth, making him look as serious as a child taking something apart. Long years later, when Smendrick's name had become a greater name than Nikos's, and worse than Efreet's, surrendered at the sound of it. Okay, wait a minute. Long years later, when Smendrik's name had become a greater name than Nikos and worse than Afrit's surrendered at the sound of it, he was never able to work the smallest magic without seeing Prince Lear before him, his eyes squinting up because of the brightness and his tongue sticking out. The Red Bull stamped again, and Prince Lear fell on his face and got up bleeding. The bull's rumble began, and the blind, bloated head started down, lowering like one half of the scales of doom. Lear's vibrant heart hung between the pale horns, as good as dripping from their tips, himself as good as smashed and scattered. And his mouth buckled a little, but he never moved. The sound of the bull grew louder as the hooves went down. Then Smendrik stepped into the open and said a few words. They began short words, indistinguishable either by melody or harshness, and Smendrik himself could not hear them for the Red Bull's dreadful bawling. But he knew what they meant, and he knew exactly how to say them, and he knew that he could say them again when he wanted to, in the same way or in a different way. Now he spoke them gently and with joy, and as he did so, he felt his immortality fall from him, like armor or like a shroud. At the first word of the spell, the Lady Malthea gave a thin, bitter cry. She reached out again to Prince Lear, but he had his back to her, protecting her, and he did not hear. Molly grew heartsick, caught at Smendrik's arm, but the magician spoke on. Yet even when the wonder blossomed where she had been, sea white, as boundlessly beautiful as the bull was mighty, still the Lady Amalthea clung to herself for a moment more. She was no longer there, and yet her face hovered like a breath in the cold, reeky light. It would have been better if Prince Lear had not turned until she was gone, but he turned. He saw the unicorn, and she shone in him as in a glass. But it was to the other that he called, to the castaway, to the Lady Amalthea. His voice was the end of her. She vanished when he cried her name, and though he had crowed for day. He cried her name as though he had crowed for a day. Things happened both swiftly and slowly, and as they do in dreams, where it is really the same thing. The unicorn stood very still, looking at them, all out of lost elsewhere eyes. She seemed even more beautiful than Smendrik remembered, for no one can keep a unicorn in his head for long. And yet she was not as she had been, no more than he was. Molly started towards her, speaking softly and foolishly, but the unicorn gave no sign that she knew her. The marvelous horn remained dull as rain. With a roar that set the walls of the lair belling out and cracking like circus canvas, the Red Bull charged for the second time. The unicorn fled across the cave and into the darkness. Prince Lear, in turning, had stepped a little to one side, and before he could wheel back again, the bull's plunging pursuit smashed him down, stunning with his mouth open. Molly would have gone to him, but Smendrik took hold of her and dragged her along after the bull and the unicorn. Neither beast was in sight, but the tunnel still thundered from their desperate passage. Dazed and bewildered, Molly stumbled beside the fierce stranger, who would neither let her fall nor slacken her pace. Over her head and all around, she could feel the castle groaning, creaking in the rock like a loosening tooth. The witch's rhyme jangled in her memory over and over. Yet none but one of Hagsgate's town may bring the castle swirling down. Suddenly it was sand slowing their feet, and the smell of the sea, cold as the other smell, but so good, so friendly, that they both stopped running and laughed aloud. Above them, on the cliff, King Haggard's castle splayed up towards a gray-green morning sky, splashed with thin, milky clouds. Molly was sure that the king himself would be watching from one of the tremulous towers, but she could not see him. A few stars still fluttered in the heavy blue sky over the water. The tide was out, the the bald beach had the gray, wet gleam of a stripped shellfish. But far down the strand the sea was bending like a bow, and Molly knew that the ebb had ended. The unicorn and the Red Bull stood facing each other at the arch of the bow, and the unicorn's back was to the sea. The bull moved in slowly, not charging, but pressing her almost gently towards the water, never touching her. She did not resist him. Her horn was dark, and her head was down, and the bull was as much her master as he had been on the plain of Hagsgate before she became the Lady Amalthea. It might have been the same hopeless dawn, except for the sea. Yet she was not altogether beaten. She backed away until one hind hoof actually stepped in the water. At this, she sprang through the sullen smolder of the Red Bull and ran away along the beach, so swift and light that the wind of her passing blew her footprints off the sand. The bull went after her. "Do something," a hoarse voice said to Smendrick, as Molly had said it long ago. Prince Lear stood behind him, his face bloody and his eyes mad. He looked like King Haggard. "Do something," he said. "You have power. You changed her into a unicorn. Do something now and save her. I will kill you if you don't." He showed the magician his hands. "I cannot," Smendrick answered him quietly. "Not all the magic in the world could help her now. If she will not fight him, she must go into the sea with the others. Neither magic nor murder will help her." Molly heard small waves slapping on the sand. The tide was beginning to turn. She saw no unicorns tumbling in the water, though she looked for them, willing them to be there. What if it's too late? What if they drifted out on the last ebb tide out to the deepest sea, where no ships go because of the kraken and the sea drake, and because of the floating jungles of wrack and tangle and drown? Even though these, she will never find them. Then would she stay with me? "And what is magic for?" Prince Lear demanded wildly. "What use is wizardry if it cannot save a unicorn?" He gripped the magician's shoulder hard to keep from falling. Smendrick did not turn his head. With a touch of sad mockery in his voice, he said, "That's what heroes are for." They could not see the unicorn for the hugeness of the bull, but suddenly she doubled on her back and came flying up the beach towards them, blind and patient as the sea. The Red Bull followed her, his hooves gouging great ditches in the damp sand. Smoke and fire spraying spray and storm, they came together, neither one gaining, and Prince Lear gave a soft grunt of understanding. "Yes, of course," he said. "That is exactly what heroes are for. Wizards make no difference. So they say that nothing does, but heroes are meant to die for unicorns." He let go of Smendrick's shoulder, smiling to himself. "There is a basic fallacy in your reasoning," Smendrick began indignantly, but the prince never heard what it was. The unicorn flashed by them, her breath streaming blue-white, and her head carried too high, and Prince Lear leaped into the path of the Red Bull. For a moment he disappeared entirely, like a feather in a flame. The bull ran over him, and left him lying on the ground, one side of his face cuddled too hard into the sand, and one leg kicking the air 3 times before it stopped. He fell without a cry, and Smendrick and Molly alike were stricken as silent as he. Okay, wait a minute. He fell without a cry, and Smendrick and Molly alike were stricken as silent as he. But the unicorn turned. The Red Bull halted when she did, and wheeled to put her once more between himself and the sea. He, be- he began his mincing, dancing advance again, but he might have been he might have been a courting bird for all the attention the unicorn paid him. She stood motionless, staring at the twisted body of Prince Lear. The tide was grumbling and hard now, and the beach was already a slice narrower. White caps and skippers' daughters spilled up into the sprawling dawn, but Molly Grew still saw no other unicorns but her own. Over the castle the sky was scarlet, and on the highest tower King Haggard stood up, as clear and black as a winter tree. Molly could see the straight scar of his mouth, and his nails darkened as he gripped the parapet. But the castle cannot fall now. Only Lear could have made it fall. Suddenly the unicorn screamed. It was not at all like the challenging bell with which she first met the Red Bull. It was an ugly, squawking wail of sorrow and loss and rage, such as no immortal creature ever gave. The castle quaked, and King Haggard shrank back with one arm across his face. The Red Bull hesitated, shuffling in the sand, lowing doubtfully. The unicorn cried out again and reared up like a scimitar. The sweet sweep of her body made Molly close her eyes, but she opened them again in time to see the unicorn leap at the Red Bull, and the bull swerve out of her way. The unicorn's horn was light again, burning and shivering like a butterfly. Again she charged, and again the bull gave ground, heavy with perplexity, but still quick as a fish. His own horns were the color and likeness of lightning, and the slightest swing of his head made her stagger. But he retreated and retreated, backing steadily down the beach, as she had done. She lunged after him, driving to kill, but she could not reach him. She might have been stabbing at a shadow or at a memory. So the Red Bull fell back without giving battle until she had stalked him to the water's edge. There he made his stand, with the surf swirling about his hooves and the sand rushing away under them. He would neither fight nor fly, and she knew now that she could never destroy him. Still she set herself for another charge, while he muttered wonderingly in his throat. For Molly Grew, for Molly Grew, the world hung motionless in that glass moment, as though she were standing on a higher tower than King Haggard. She looked down on a pale paring of land, where a toy man and woman stared with their knitted eyes at a clay bowl and a tiny ivory unicorn. Abandoned playthings. There was another doll, too, half buried in as a sandcastle, with a stick king propped up in one tilted turret. The tide would take it all in a moment, and nothing would be left but the flaccid birds of the beach hopping in circles. Then Smendrick shook her back to his side, saying, "Molly, far out to sea, the combers were coming in. The long, heavy rollers curling over white across their green hearts, tearing themselves to smoke on the sandbars and the shiny rocks, rasping up the beach with a sound like fire. The birds flew up in yelling clumps, their strident outrage lost in the cry of the waves like pens, and in the whiteness of the whiteness flowing in the tattered waters, their bodies arched with the streaked marble hollows of the waves. Their manes and tails and the fragile beards of the males burned in the sunlight with eyes as dark and jeweled as the deep sea. And the shining of the horns, the seashell shining of the horns. The horns came riding in like like the rainbow masts of silver ships. But they would not come to land while the bull was there. They rolled in the shallows, swirling together as madly as frightened fish when the nets are being hauled up, no longer with the sea but losing it. Hundreds were borne in with each swell and hurled against the ones already struggling to keep from being shoved ashore, and they, in their turn, struck out desperately, rearing and stumbling, stretching their long, cloudy necks far back. The unicorn lowered her head one last time and hurled herself at the Red Bull. If he had been either true flesh or a windy ghost, the blow might have burst him like rotten fruit. But he turned away, unnoticing, and walked slowly into the sea. The unicorns in the water floundered wildly to let him by, stamping and slashing the surf into a rolling mist, which their horns turned rainbow. But on the beach and atop the cliff and up and down through all of Hagrid's kingdom, the land sighed when his weight had passed from it. He strode out a long way before he began to swim. The hugest waves broke no higher than his hocks, and the timid tide ran away from him. But when at last he let himself sink into the flood, there was a great surge of the sea stood up behind him. A green and black swell, as deep and smooth and hard as the wind, it gathered in silence, folding from one horizon to the other, until for a moment it actually hid the Red Bull's humped shoulders and sloping back. Spendrick lifted the dead prince, and he and Molly ran until the cliff face stopped them. The waves fell like a cloudburst of chains. Then the unicorns came out of the sea. Molly never saw them clearly. They were a light leaping towards her and a cry that dazzled her eyes. She was wise enough to know that no mortal was ever meant to see all the unicorns in the world, and she tried to find her own unicorn and look only at her, but there were too many of them, and they were too beautiful. Blind as the bull, she moved to meet them, holding out her arms. The unicorns would surely have run her down as the Red Bull had trampled Prince Lear, for they were mad with freedom. But Spendrick spoke, and they streamed to the right and left of Molly and Lear and himself, some even springing over them as the sea shatters on a rock and then comes whirling together again. All around Molly these flowed and flowered, a light as impossible as snow, set afire with thousands of cloven hooves, sang by like cymbals. She stood very still, neither weeping nor laughing, for her joy was too great for her body to understand. "Look up," Spendrick said. "The castle is falling." She turned and saw that the towers were melting, and the unicorns sprang up the cliff and flowed around them, exactly as though they had been made out of sand, and the sea were sliding in. The castle came down in great cold chunks that turned thin and waxen as they swirled in the air until they disappeared. It crumbled and vanished without a sound, and it left no ruins either on land or in the memories of the two who watched it fall. A minute later they could not remember where it had stood or how it had looked. But King Haggard, who was quite real, fell down through the wreckage of his disenchanted castle, like a knife dropped through clouds. Molly heard him laugh once, as though he had expected it. Very little ever surprised King Haggard. We are going to stop the reading there and continue this at another time. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'm going to put a bookmark in here. We have been reading from The Last Unicorn by Peter Beagle. If you like this content, make sure you like and subscribe and ring the bell so you know when I upload. And if you want to support me in any way, all that information is in the description below. Thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.